American boots, American bases, American soil, planted right in the heart of the Persian Gulf. Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the largest U.S. military installation in the entire Middle East, housing thousands of American troops, nuclear-capable bombers, and the forward command of U.S. Central Command itself, sitting directly under Iranian ballistic missiles. And Washington is not firing back. Let that sink in for a moment. The most powerful military machine in human history, the force that reshaped Iraq, dismembered Libya, and policed the South China Sea, is absorbing Iranian strikes and standing down. This is not weakness. This is calculation, cold, surgical, geopolitical calculation happening at a level most American news networks will never explain to you, because what is unfolding right now is not simply a military confrontation. It is a fundamental restructuring of deterrence, of alliance, of who actually holds leverage in the 21st century Persian Gulf. The old rules are burning. New ones are being written in real time. So let us go back to the beginning, because context is everything in geopolitics. And without context, you are just watching a fire without understanding who lit the match, who owns the building, and who benefits from the insurance payout. Al Udeid Air Base did not appear overnight. It was built over decades, expanded through billions of dollars of Qatari financing. Yes, you heard that correctly. Qatar paid for a significant portion of the infrastructure that houses American military power on its own soil. Think about that arrangement for a moment. A small Gulf monarchy sitting on one of the largest natural gas reserves on the planet, essentially bankrolling the forward operating base of the American empire in the Middle East. That is not a simple landlord and tenant relationship. That is a deeply entangled web of mutual dependency, strategic leverage, and political survival on multiple levels simultaneously. Qatar has always played this extraordinary double game. On one hand, it hosts American military power. On the other hand, it maintains open channels with Iran, with Hamas, with the Taliban, with actors that Washington officially designates as adversaries or terrorists. Doha has always positioned itself as the indispensable mediator, the tiny state that can talk to everyone precisely because it is protected by the American military umbrella, while simultaneously keeping its economic and diplomatic lines open to the other side. This is not hypocrisy. This is survival strategy at the highest level of sophistication. And right now, with Iranian missiles landing on or near American installations on Qatari soil, that entire balancing act is being stress tested like never before in its history. Now let us talk about Iran, because the Western media will give you a cartoonish version of what Tehran is doing and why. Iran did not wake up one morning and decide to randomly fire missiles at American bases out of pure aggression. Iranian strategic doctrine, going back decades, is built around what they call the forward defense model. The idea is that you do not wait for the war to come to your borders. You project deterrence outward through proxies, through missile arsenals, through a carefully constructed architecture of what they call the axis of resistance. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, various factions in Iraq and Syria, Hamas in Gaza. These are not random terror groups from Tehran's perspective. They are chess pieces on a regional board, and Iran has been playing that chess game with extraordinary patience and strategic depth for 4 decades. But here is what is critical to understand about the current moment. When Iran fires directly at American installations, it is sending a message that operates on multiple frequencies at once. It is telling Washington, we have the capability and we are willing to use it. It is telling the Gulf monarchies, your American protectors are not invincible. It is telling its own domestic audience, we are standing firm against the empire. And simultaneously, by calibrating the strikes in a way that does not trigger a full American counteroffensive, Iran is also saying, we are not suicidal, we understand the limits, we are not trying to start World War III today. This is coercive diplomacy conducted through missile trajectories, and it requires an enormous level of strategic nerve to execute. And Washington, for its part, is not firing back in the way that its own military doctrine and public posturing would normally demand. That restraint is perhaps the most significant geopolitical signal in this entire episode, because the American military establishment, from its Central Command Forward Headquarters at Al Udeid to the Pentagon to the National Security Council, is performing a calculation that goes far beyond the immediate exchange of fire. They are asking themselves, what happens if we escalate fully? What does a comprehensive American military campaign against Iran actually look like in the current global environment? And the answers they are coming up with are deeply uncomfortable, because the world of 2024 and 2025 is profoundly different from the world in which American military supremacy went essentially unchallenged. Russia is consumed in Ukraine but has not been defeated. China has been watching every American military engagement with forensic attention and drawing its own conclusions about American overextension and strategic exhaustion. The Global South, that vast collection of nations across Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, has been drifting systematically away from automatic alignment with Washington's positions. The BRICS expansion, the growth of non-dollar trade arrangements, the emergence of new diplomatic frameworks that exclude the United States entirely, all of this is the background radiation against which this confrontation in the Persian Gulf is unfolding. And it fundamentally changes the American calculus in ways that the mainstream American media is almost entirely failing to communicate to the American public. Let us talk about oil, because you cannot understand the Persian Gulf without understanding the hydrocarbon geography that makes it the most strategically critical real estate on the planet. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow choke point between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, carries approximately 20% of all the world's traded oil through its waters every single day. Iranian military doctrine has long identified the Strait of Hormuz as its ultimate leverage point, the card it holds that can send shockwaves through the entire global economy within hours of being played. Every Iranian missile that lands near Al Udeid is also a reminder to global energy markets that Tehran has the ability and the stated willingness to disrupt Hormuz if pushed to the wall. And that reminder is not lost on anyone, not on Wall Street, not on Beijing, not on Berlin, not on Tokyo, not on any economy on earth that depends on the uninterrupted flow of Gulf energy. The Qatari dimension of this story is also profoundly underreported in the American media, and it deserves serious attention. Qatar is the world's leading exporter of liquefied natural gas. European countries desperate for energy security since the disruption of Russian pipeline supplies following the Ukraine conflict have become significantly more dependent on Qatari LNG to keep their economies running and their populations warm. This gives Qatar an economic leverage over Europe that is entirely independent of any American military relationship. So when Iranian missiles are striking near American bases on Qatari soil, the European chancelleries are paying extremely close attention, because a destabilized Qatar is not an abstract geopolitical problem for Brussels or Berlin. It is a direct threat to their energy supply chains. And that European vulnerability is another layer of complexity in why Washington cannot simply respond with overwhelming force and call it settled. There is also the question of what is happening inside the American military and political establishment right now, because it is not a monolith, it never is, and the internal debates are fierce. There are voices within the Pentagon and within the broader national security community who believe that sustained restraint in the face of Iranian strikes will ultimately destroy American deterrence credibility, not just in the Middle East, but globally. Their argument is straightforward. If you absorb direct attacks on your bases without meaningful military response, you send a message to every adversary from Pyongyang to Moscow to Beijing that American red lines are negotiable, that American responses are predictable in their restraint, that the cost of challenging American power is manageable. This is the hawk argument, and it has serious strategic logic behind it. But there is another set of voices, equally credentialed, equally serious, who look at the current global landscape and see the hawk's prescription as a path to catastrophic overextension. Their argument is that a full military campaign against Iran would require resources, attention, and political capital that the United States simply does not have in surplus right now. Ukraine is ongoing. Taiwan tensions remain elevated. The American defense industrial base is already strained by the demands of supplying munitions to multiple theaters simultaneously, and perhaps most critically, a military campaign against Iran risks triggering the very Hormuz closure that would send global energy prices into a stratosphere that would devastate the American domestic economy, fuel inflation, and potentially destabilize the political order at home. These are the voices that appear to be winning the current argument, and their victory is what explains the restraint that Washington is currently displaying. Meanwhile, the Qatari government is in an extraordinarily difficult position that its sophisticated diplomatic corps is working around the clock to manage. Qatar cannot publicly criticize Iran without potentially undermining its own role as a mediator and closing the back channels that Doha has spent years carefully cultivating. But Qatar also cannot appear indifferent to the fact that its territory is effectively becoming a battlefield, because that would signal to its own population and to regional observers that Qatari sovereignty is meaningless, that the tiny emirate is just a passive venue for great power confrontation rather than an active sovereign state with agency and interests of its own. The Qatari royal family is performing one of the most delicate diplomatic balancing acts in the world right now, and the margin for error is essentially zero. The role of Saudi Arabia in all of this is also worth examining carefully because Riyadh and Tehran have been engaged in their own extraordinary rapprochement process, brokered significantly by China, and that process has fundamentally altered the regional equation. The old binary of a Sunni Arab bloc led by Saudi Arabia squaring off against Shia Iran, backed by the United States and Israel respectively, has been complicated enormously by the Beijing-brokered Saudi-Iranian normalization. Saudi Arabia is no longer automatically in lockstep with Washington's Iran policy. Riyadh has its own economic agenda centered on Vision 2030, its own relationship with Beijing and Moscow to manage, and its own conclusion that endless regional conflict serves none of its developmental interests. This means that the traditional American assumption of Gulf Arab solidarity against Iran is simply no longer operative in the way it once was, and that changes the entire strategic map. And then there is Israel, which cannot be separated from any discussion of Iranian missile activity in the region because Israeli and Iranian forces have been engaged in direct exchanges that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. The Israeli calculation around Iran is in some ways the mirror image of Washington's dilemma. Israel desperately wants American military support for a decisive strike on Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure. Washington is desperately trying to avoid being dragged into a conflict that serves Israeli strategic interests, but potentially devastates American strategic interests globally. This tension between Washington and Tel Aviv is real, it is deep, and it is playing out in real time against the backdrop of Iranian missiles hitting American bases in Qatar. You have to understand the information environment in which all of this is happening as well, because it is itself a theater of operations. The Iranian state media presents these strikes as acts of justified resistance against American imperialism. The American corporate media either downplays the strikes to avoid creating panic or frames them exclusively as Iranian aggression without any of the historical and strategic context that would allow American citizens to actually understand what is happening and why. The result is that the American public, which in a democracy is theoretically the ultimate source of authority over questions of war and peace, is being systematically denied the information it needs to form coherent opinions about what its government is doing and why. That is a democratic crisis running parallel to the military and geopolitical crisis. The long arc of this situation bends toward a negotiated arrangement, because the alternative is a war that no rational actor on any side genuinely wants. Iran does not want to be bombed back to the Stone Age. The United States does not want to absorb the costs of another Middle Eastern land war. Qatar does not want its gas infrastructure turned into rubble. Saudi Arabia does not want regional chaos derailing Vision 2030. China does not want the global energy supply disrupted when its own economic recovery depends on stable commodity markets. Russia is too consumed elsewhere to want a new crisis demanding its attention. Even Israel, for all its hawkish rhetoric, does not want to fight Iran alone. So the missiles are flying and the responses are being calibrated and the diplomats are talking in rooms that the cameras never see. And what is being negotiated in those rooms will ultimately determine whether this moment becomes a footnote in history or a turning point that reshapes the entire architecture of Middle Eastern and global order. What you are watching, stripped of all the noise and the propaganda and the partisan framing, is a negotiation conducted through military signaling. Iran is establishing its deterrence coordinates. America is establishing its tolerance thresholds. And somewhere in the space between those two sets of signals, the outlines of a new regional arrangement are being drawn. It will not look like what either side publicly claims to want. It never does. Geopolitical reality is always messier and more compromised than the official narratives on any side. But the direction of travel is clear enough to those paying careful attention. The era of unchallenged American military dominance in the Persian Gulf, the era that began with the first Gulf War in 1991 and ran through the invasion of Iraq and the long years of maximum pressure on Iran, that era is in the process of fundamental revision, not ending overnight, not collapsing in a single dramatic moment, but being renegotiated, reshaped, redistributed across a more multipolar set of power arrangements. And Al Udeid Air Base, sitting there under the Persian Gulf sky with Iranian missiles having already demonstrated their reach, is the most vivid symbol of that renegotiation that exists anywhere on the planet right now.